On the morning of September 17, 1862, the Union Army began its assault on Lee's left flank, commanded by legendary General Stonewall Jackson, whose men had been rushed to the battlefield the previous day after capturing the Harper's Ferry arsenal. Jackson's men were footsore and hungry, but were positioned on good ground, awaiting the Union onslaught. The battle began at 5:30 a.m. General George McClellan was ready to move on Lee's Army of Northern Virginia and ordered General Joe Hooker's 1st Corps to attack the Confederates at his front. Fighting Joe Hooker could see a rise in the distance near the Dunker Church, a modest whitewashed building belonging to a local sect of German Baptists on the Hagerstown Turnpike, and using the road as a guide, began to move men of his 2nd Division under James B. Ricketts into Miller's Cornfield. As his men approached what would become some of the most contested and blood-soaked ground of the entire war, General Hooker noticed Confederate bayonets sticking up above the cornstalks to the south. Without hesitation, he ordered 9 batteries on the ridge behind the North Woods and 20 20-pounder Parrott rifles 2 miles east of Antietam Creek to begin firing over his men to clear the field for his advance. This began an all-out artillery barrage, which was quickly answered by the Confederates under Colonel Stephen D. Lee on the high ground across the pike from the Dunker Church to the south, and the horse artillery batteries under Jeb Stuart on Nicodemus Hill to the west. The cannon fire was so intense and ferocious that Colonel Lee would later describe the exchange as artillery hell. The cornfield before Hooker's men was occupied by Confederate skirmishers of the 38th Georgia. The first Union units to enter the cornfield were under the command of General Abram Duryee of the 1st Brigade. Duryee moved his 4 regiments of the 107th Pennsylvania, the 97th New York, the 104th New York, and the 105th New York through the head-high corn under heavy cannon fire. Duryee's orders were simple, if not difficult. Occupy the high ground in front of the Dunker Church. But blocking his path were Confederate units under the command of General Marcellus Douglas of Lawton's brigade. Douglas had recently been promoted to lead the brigade when his commander, Alexander Lawton, was moved up to division command after General Ewell was badly wounded at 2nd Manassas, a wound that would cost him a leg in the defense of the South. Under Douglas were the units of the 26th Georgia, the 38th Georgia, the 60th Georgia, the 61st Georgia, the 13th Georgia, and the 12th Georgia. The Confederates lay just under the crest of the hill in the open field, waiting for the Yankees to appear in the corn. General Douglas gave orders to the brigade to pick a row of corn and fire down it once the Union Army materialized. Douglas, an officer known from leading from the front, said to have had a death wish after his wife and young child had died of disease in 1861, paced restlessly behind his prone brigade in anticipation for the battle that would be his last. When the Confederate skirmishers, who were by this time taking heavy cannon fire, saw the colors of Duryee's men flying above the corn, headed their way, they ran, tripping over the snake rail fence back to the safety of the Confederate lines. Confederate soldiers yelled as they approached, "What you running from?" which the skirmishers answered breathlessly as they fell into line, "You'll soon see." Duryee's men crossed the 240-yard cornfield in a matter of minutes, which must have seemed like an eternity under the intense cannon barrage. As the Union soldiers reached the snake rail fence, the men of Lawton's brigade rose up and delivered a terrible volley into the boys in blue, who were for the most part just happy to have reached the end of the cornfield. For many of these young men, they had reached the end of their lives. Union soldiers fell where they stood even before they could get off a shot. But Duryee's men withstood the hailstorm of lead and began to pour their own rain of death into the Confederate lines. The 107th Pennsylvania and the 97th New York were in a fight for their very existence. But half of Duryee's brigade were somewhat covered by the terrain, so he moved the 104th and 105th New York out of the cornfield and up the hill in an attempt to turn the Confederate right flank. Around the same time, Douglas was moving his 26th Georgia up to attack the left flank of Duryee's brigade, supported by the 38th Georgia. Musket fire was heavy and close. The 107th New York wheeled to face the enemy, attempting in vain to anchor Duryee's unsupported right, fighting for their very lives in the corn, which was quickly becoming irrigated with the blood and sweat of these men. For the Confederates, luck would have it that Douglas had positioned 2 units of his brigade on a slight angle facing away from the cornfield to protect his right flank from the east woods, which were still contested from skirmishers the night before by men under George Meade. So as the Union Army appeared on the hill to his right flank, at the point of the angle, Douglas wheeled the regiments of the 12th and 13th Georgia to face the enemy. A deadly fire ensued all down the lines, and men from both armies fell in heaps, including Douglas himself, who was shot and killed during the engagement. Command of the brigade then fell to Major John H. Lowe of the 31st Georgia, who would in turn be badly wounded and carried to the rear. The brigade would ultimately be assigned to Colonel John H. Lamar of the 61st Georgia. Such was the devastation of Lawton's brigade in the early morning of September 17th. Duryee, who had expected reinforcements from George L. Hartsuff and Colonel William A. Christian, which never arrived, eventually realized his 1st Brigade was alone and extended far beyond the safety of the main Union force, and was very close to being completely destroyed. Hartsuff had been wounded during artillery hell, and Christian had dismounted and fled to the rear in terror. So reluctantly, after 30 minutes of fighting, Duryee ordered his men to withdraw back to the cornfield and the north woods beyond.